Hi, I'm Jayme Hansen. I'm trying to write a weekly blog just to share some ideas and to learn from other people. And if there's topics that you would like me to talk about, I'm more than happy to share my ideas about them. At work, I kind of got this idea because one of my colleagues at work had told me that he had some problems with his sons. He had three sons, and how they're not doing well at school. One of them really got bad grades, and he was worried about the success of his son. So I had suggested to him that he should maybe think about tutoring. And of course, I don't know why it never crossed his mind, but it didn't. And so after some talk, he thought that was a great idea and had asked for the phone numbers for the tutors that we use. So I know in the past, other parents that I've spoken to have asked me, how did your kids become successful, or hey, what methods should I use for teaching or training or coaching? So I'd like to share some of those ideas with you. We've always been interested in the success of our children, and I think most parents are. However, it takes the parent to kind of monitor their kids, ask them the right questions, and see how they're doing. When we initially moved to the place in the United States, we knew that more than likely we had to move to the right neighborhood. So we did a lot of research. There are systems online that tells you where the better schools are located and stuff like that. And so we searched for the right neighborhood. We moved to the right neighborhood. We paid probably several $100,000 more for a home just so that we can move into that correct neighborhood with the good schools. Initially, we were extremely happy with our decision. The public schools were very good. The older teachers that were there did a fantastic job. They were very engaged. They gave additional homework to our son. They challenged him, and again, he was doing very exceptional. He was in the smarter kids group, and he was probably a year ahead compared to the average peers at that time. The following year, unfortunately, I was deployed. I was sent to Afghanistan. I was gone away from home for an entire year, and when I came back, this positive attitude about school had dissipated. He wasn't doing very well at school, and so we looked into that, and what we found was Jason was being repeated essentially first grade. Everything that he advanced in was repeated, and he was quite bored at school. And because of this, we realized that we needed to get more engaged, that the public school, it was kind of rolling of the dice, and we needed to ensure that whoever we paid was more engaged, that we could have influence on that. And so we decided to spend a lot of money and put him in private school. And we enrolled both of our children into the Montessori school system. And again, initially we were extremely happy with that. A lot of people know Montessori to having their self-paced mathematics and having some language-centric programs, which they teach them foreign languages, for instance. And so we were quite happy. Over time, I remember as he was reading a book, there were some vocabulary words that he just didn't understand, and I thought that he should be grasping those type of words at that time. And so luckily enough, our next door neighbor was an English teacher for something like 30 years, and she was an English tutor. So we started utilizing her services, and learned that he was a little bit behind. And so we realized that grammar and language and vocabulary was equally as important. A lot of people, realize that their kids may struggle a bit in a certain subject. But I have learned over time that there's only just a few areas that where maybe a parent should focus in, and those are the primary things that the children should definitely learn through time. And those three things that we typically see throughout life are the same three things that you're tested over and over again, and they typically include stuff from like PSAT, SATs, ACT tests, and then when you go to graduate school, it's GRE, GMAT, those type of tests, and they focus in three centric areas, and they are mathematics, reading, and writing. And so I think if a parent can ensure that their child are able to do those three things well, other things such as history, because primarily that's reading, and in science, again, that's a combination of mathematics and reading oftentimes, and some writing even. Those kind of things will just fall into place. So I'd like to share a story that I learned just recently, and that is when they start building jets and airplanes actually it was the Army, and then it became the Air Force. Pilots were crashing the planes all the time. And so they thought, well, it's because the planes, when we design them, when we build them, they're a certain size. So what they started to do then was to try to curtail the pilots to the plane. So they were looking for certain individuals that were within a certain height, had a certain arm reach, things like that, in order that they could fit the planes better. But that didn't help, and they still had these very high accident rates and crash rates. Our school system is kind of like that, in which kids are forced into the school curriculum, and it's not curtailed to them at all whatsoever. And it's kind of like those pilots. And what the military eventually learned was installing systems that curtail to the pilots, and that's what improves safety, that improves agility, and reduce the safety, increase the safety, and reduce the accident rates. And that was, having seats that slid back and forth so they could reach certain devices, steering that could be moved and tilted, that can again aid in the reach. Those kind of things that helped. And we hear about this all the time throughout our adult lives anyways. I know when I went to get my graduate school, we had to take a bunch of personality tests, and we learned about the value of understanding people's personalities. And so, Myers-Briggs, or whatever the types of tests there are, there's literally dozens. I took another one called Spectrum, and there's many others out there like that. And these personality tests will determine, how a person thinks, how they learn, how they communicate, and how to, break down those barriers to improve communication and ultimately work within a company. And we learned that through that there's several modalities of learning. I learned that in psychology when I was getting my undergraduate degree. That there's visual, auditory, and I think there's kinesthetic learning, which, didactic, hands-on, or tactile, some people might call it. And again, when I got my undergraduate degree, my MBA, and even learning through the military, you learn how to work with small groups, understand again the relationships, and why it's important, and the communication chain that goes through there. So vitally important. We know all that, but yet again, we don't we don't effectively do that in the schools. No matter how good the school that you may be in, again, we don't work with medical doctors and other specialists in ensure what the greatest good for your child may be. An example of that is my daughter. Again, the teachers were complaining, saying that our daughter had ADHD. She needed to move all the time. She was very active in her classroom, and they just complained all the time that she had ADHD. And so we spent a lot of money. We got our child tested, and fortunately, we're at the right place at the right time. Because I think had we had her tested in the United States, had we had her tested anywhere else, our child would have been misdiagnosed, and she might have been on drugs for the rest of her life that did her no good. And what we found out is that she had a slow developing cochlea. Now the cochlea is used for balance, and it's used for motion and things like that, determining motion. And if it's underdeveloped, it activates the child, making them need to have more motion in order to develop those regions of the brain, or inside the ear is where it is. And so there are certain tests that can be done to determine if your child has that type of issue. Again, we're learning the beginning stages of all these different issues within people. And I would say 99.999% of the medical professions out there have no clue what this issue is. Now, a child can grow out of that. And looking back, I probably had the same type of issue. People said I had ADHD, but it's not ADHD, and that's my point. Is that it's this other issue. It cannot be treated by medication. It takes parents' willingness to understand the issue, and then putting certain things in place to help their child out. And so we did things like bought her trampolines, bought chairs that rocked, and things like that, and that really helped her develop. Did not disrupt the class as much, and allowed her to exercise and get what she really needed in order to develop that portion of her brain and that portion of her ear. And luckily enough, again, we happened to be at the right place at the right time. And the school was in Kenya, Africa, in which this British neurologist had taught there, and we learned a lot about that condition. So we were very fortunate to have met her. So now back to those. Let's talk about those three main areas that we talked about earlier. That was reading, writing, and mathematics. So I have some thoughts on that. I'd like to share some points, and then at the end, I'll just do a wrap up of other things, and then give me your thoughts and ideas. So for reading, I don't like to give my children e-readers because scientists are now starting to learn that the blue lights off the e-readers disrupt their sleeping patterns and things like that. And of course, if you give these tablets and things to your children, they'll play with them at night, and then it disrupts their ability to sleep. The blue lights in them is actually chemically changes the things inside the brain, and it's telling them it's daylight is essentially what it's doing. And so I wouldn't recommend getting them addicted to e-readers. Instead, I like to use old-fashioned books. That's what we do. I encourage them to write in the margins. I do that. It helps them to think. I ask them to highlight and underline words that they don't understand while they read, which helps in their vocabulary. So I encourage that a lot with my kids. Another thing is just cell phones. I don't think it's very good to give cell phones early on to young kids. One of the main reasons for that is that kids, when they start texting, they start abbreviating words, and of course they're going to learn that soon enough. But if they get in the habit of constantly using these abbreviations that are bastardizing the English language, they will not be able to communicate effectively when they're like in an executive setting or if they have to write professionally. And so I wouldn't recommend that at an early age. Third thing is I would recommend that you find a fingerprint safe in which they can lock up these devices, or lock and key in which you can keep the key on your keychain, because these devices, especially the games and things like that, are extremely addictive. And you can tell your children every day, all day long, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But it's extremely addictive. And so, again, I highly recommend that you limit a time limit or a day limit or just the weekend on when they can use these devices. And so those are a couple ways of possibly ensuring that it doesn't get in their hands. Okay. Another thing that we do is we give birthday. We ask our friends and family to get our children like Barnes and Noble's gift cards, and then that way we allow them to purchase any books that they wish. It encourages them to read. It encourages them again to build their vocabulary, use their imagination, and things like that. If you're unable to get them books, again, there's typically free libraries in most developed countries. So I recommend and encourage you to take your kids to the library frequently, and also encourage them at a very young age to start reading nonfiction books, because as adults, pretty much 95–99% of everything that you have to read, technical manuals at work, maybe a computer system, and when you go to university, you're learning, whatever your topic or degree is in, it's all nonfiction. And so they need to get adjusted to read nonfiction at an early age. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to be 100% nonfiction. I think fiction is good too. Like I said, it helps with the creativity aspect, but they will need to learn how to read nonfiction. Just making that point. Okay. Second topic that I want to area of focus that I want to talk to you about is writing. Like I said, my children had some problems in writing early on. Some of the things that I did was, when he was a young kid, I would encourage to take note cards and pens everywhere, and I would encourage them, like when we went and visited a zoo, hey, write down the name of the animal. When you see an animal, write down maybe the descriptions of them. Write down the questions that you may have about a certain animal and things like that. And so he started to write down a lot of things down and jot notes. And of course, that's very helpful when you become adult, or when you go to study, or you got to learn to be able to take notes and things like that, which in itself is writing. Another piece of that is that I recommend that part of writing is to expand vocabulary. There's several methods of doing that. One is just reading enough so that they can constantly expand their vocabulary. That's extremely helpful. But another thing that we utilized was SAT vocabulary cards. You can buy used flashcards very cheaply online. And so we bought that type of kit for him, and then allowed him, tested him on vocabulary. Oftentimes they don't get those anymore in school, so I encourage parents to continue to do that. They will get tested for it. Same thing with grammar. There's a grammar series books that we used early on. I can list some of these types of manuals and books on my post later on. And then lastly, is the focus in mathematics. I learned about a certain math system when I was on a plane. It so happened that a neighbor of mine was on a flight with me, and we were sitting next to each other. And I was quite shocked because she lived literally like 3 houses down. And we talked about what she did as a profession. She said, well, I'm going to fly to Singapore. And I was like, thought that was pretty interesting. I'm like, oh, you got business there? What's going on? She says, no, I'm learning about their math education over there. I'm an educator. And I'm like, why are you learning about their mathematics? Isn't mathematics universal? Isn't it the same? And she says, no, the Singaporeans typically do much better. They're one of the, number one rated in mathematics in the world. And their system is far superior. So I asked her why it was so far superior, and she said, well, unlike like Korean and Japanese, which is rote memorization and, rote memorization, she said they did a lot of problem solving. And so they would give them problem solving types of mathematical problems at a very young age, and then they built upon that. And I found that quite fascinating. So we use a Singaporean math system for our kids during their early years. Later on, as they age and become hopefully much more advanced than you are in mathematics, we use, of course, Khan Academy, which there's online video tutorials that talk about that. Typically in schools, most decent schools have like math, something called math counts, and basically it's an after-school activity in which kids can learn math. It's like at a competition level. I highly encourage parents, if there's one thing at all, to get them involved in that. And lastly, if you're just not good at math, then I recommend that you get a tutor, like some of my friends did. We utilize a tutor for several reasons, because it's frustrating for a parent to and oftentimes we're not as understanding of our kids. Like, hey, how come you don't understand it? I just taught this to you. And they're not as patient with their own kids. Well, tutors, they are paid to ensure your child knows something, and they're much more patient. Kids listen to them much better, and so if you can afford it, and your child needs help, I would recommend that. Now, there are, of course, much more to a child's education than those 3 main topics or focus areas. And so some of the other things that I think that is quite helpful, and again, if you disagree, just let me know why, and I can explain maybe in further details why these ideas are I think well needed for our kids in the future. One of the things is they're taking cursive writing out. If you ever tried printing and again taking notes and things like that, you will always have to do that. And if you're able to do cursive writing, it's much more fluid and it's much faster. And I think that will help your kids gain an edge over other children. And if you look at historical documents, there's so many historical documents that are in cursive that if your child does not know how to read it, and they're going to do research later on, and they can't, read any of it, it's no good to them. And so, and again, that's just my opinion. I think if you thought about it for a moment, you see the need for that. Second thing is helping children how to focus. So recent studies shown that if you can help your child how to focus early on, so now like the leading cutting edge schools in the United States will do an exercise where they may get like a very long rope, and then they'll place it like inside of a classroom, and the child will have to try to trace and follow that rope. And while the child is tracing and following that rope, in order to distract them even further, they may have to hold like an egg on a spoon. And as they're doing that, the older children are maybe beating drums or sticks together or making noises. And that child has to concentrate and how to navigate. Those are type of issues that children are not taught at an early age. What helps them is help them to concentrate, and it really helps them as adults later on. So again, this goes back to studying. How do you reduce noises, things like that. And so we bought earmuffs that deadens the noise around their environment. Reduce the distractors, that kind of thing. And so those are kind of things that help your child out over the long haul. These educators are starting to realize those type of exposures are really helping children to do better in a real life setting. Next is memory recall. I used to get a shoot box, and I would place like 20 items inside that shoot box, and I would change items out, put different items in, shake it up, move it to a different location and stuff like that. And I would open it up and I would try to have my son look inside. I would give him like a minute to look, and after 60 seconds I would close it, and then I'd ask him to write as many items as he could recall as a child. And I think that really helped him with memory recall. Again, your child needs to be tested on memory recall, and oftentimes today, especially today, children are taught how to copy. So let's say do a book report or do this or do that, and they just copy it. They'll say learn about this science, maybe on weather. They go on the website. They said, okay, these are 16 items. They go click, copy, click, paste. They're done, but they don't really learn it. There's no ability to recall, and part of learning is that recall portion. And so, again, cutting edge schools are doing that. They'll take, for instance, a note card, and they'll say, yesterday's lesson, they could have maybe 50 questions in there, and they'll put it in, and they'll maybe randomly draw 5 questions from the previous day's learning, and they'll continue to put it in a fishbowl and fish out items as they learn it, and that help them maintain that recall. Something to consider for your children to learn. Lastly, I think languages are also very important. There's that joke, what do you call a person that speaks 3 languages? Trilingual, 2 languages, bilingual, 1 language, an American. And we got to get away from that, because kids will have to learn how to interact with multicultural setting. They have to, part of that is also learning languages. It does more than just give them again, the ability to speak another language, but there's culture that's associated with that. Again, it builds a different portion of the brain, and that kind of similar to like learning a musical instrument, which I also highly recommend. Because what happens when a child learns a musical instrument, it adds additional folds to the brain, and it makes them actually much smarter. Einstein played the violin. People who do play musical instruments, they find out that they do have these additional folds in their brains, and so that just again expands a lot of things. As children learn sheet music, they learn, which helps associate with language, learn another language and things like that. I know many years ago when I was trying to apply to different programs in the military, I remember speaking to a cryptologist. They actually have a special branch that do cryptology, and they were telling me that people who play musical instruments typically fared better at cryptology because they could see patterns They're better at problem solving, and they saw linkages where other people couldn't see these linkages. And so it's pretty exciting to understand the human brain and how you can, again, utilize what you learn to help your child. Couple other points that I'm done. One is nutrition. Ensure that your child gets good nutrition. That's cutting out soda. If they do like soda, then give them diet. I know there's still a big discussion on if that's even good too. It's not. We already know that. But I think diet is better than, sugar that they get through the soda, because then they're going to have, possible diabetes and other issues like that too. So it's a trade-off, hopefully, but pay attention to the nutrition. Exercise, get them involved in sports, running, whatever. That alone increases a person's IQ by 5 to 10 points. So get them engaged in some type of exercise as much as possible. So lastly, just have positive expectations of your child. Let them know that you expect them to go to college, you expect them to do well in school. Give them positive reaffirming, saying, hey, you are capable. But then give them the tools for who they are. So tell me what you think. Share with me any ideas that you may have, and also share with me anything else that you would like to share or would like me to talk about. Thanks.